After the Huawei CFO's homecoming, better days ahead for China's thorny ties with Canada and possibly the U.S.? That's the question to be asked later for a discussion. Next. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The case of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou was one for the books. It has come to represent a much bigger case, not just the one Chinese company executive trying to go back home, but of a broader effort against a U.S. crackdown on China's tech champions. Since her 2018 arrest in Vancouver after a U.S. extradition request, her case has strained relations among China, Canada, and the U.S. Now that she's back home, what does it mean for ties among the three countries, particularly China and Canada in this sense? Let's turn to our panelists. For more on the story of Meng Wanzhou and what it means for China-Canada ties in Ottawa, Dan Donovan, publisher and managing editor of Ottawa Life magazine. In Calgary, Canada, Carlos Day, the director of the Center on Trade and Investment Policy from the Canada West Foundation. What a pleasure, gentlemen, to see both of you. It's been quite a big day, in fact, isn't it?
I'm very pleased to see that between China and the United States and Canada, we've been able to resolve this impasse, and hopefully it will signal getting back to more positive relations.
Is it too optimistic when you say that?
We've said from day one when Ms. Meng Wanzhou was detained that it was, in our view, it was a mistake. And there are many, many Canadians who feel the same way, many in government, former diplomats, former prime ministers here. As you will recall, she was detained in December of 2018 at the request of the Trump administration, in particular, using an extradition treaty that many questioned if that was appropriate. And as you also may recall, the Americans went to several other countries and made the request for them to detain Ms. Meng, and they refused. Unfortunately for Canada, we were in the middle of a trade negotiation with the United States, and I believe they put a lot of pressure on us to detain her, and it was completely inappropriate. And I think in the long term, it's unfortunate it's taken 3 years, but now it has come to a conclusion that could have frankly happened 3 years ago.
So how should we see the very different reactions and the political atmosphere in both countries in terms of seeking a reality, a realistic relationship between the two countries?
Indeed, there is a lot of very heated political rhetoric on both sides, and that has leaked into the general population as well. But when you look at the actions of individuals and the interest of individuals here, it does not necessarily align with a lot of the harsher things we've heard in the media. What you hear captures the attention. It gets recorded because it makes noise. It's news. In China, though, the public tends to manifest its displeasure on these issues with things like consumer boycotts. In Canada, we've had a great deal of anger expressed to the pollsters, but if you look at the trade data, ordinary Canadians throughout this ordeal have been at 4.5% on average, increasing trade with China. So the anger in Canada that you hear is Canadians telling one thing to pollsters and one thing to politicians, and telling something completely different to the private sector and to businesses when they make spending decisions.
I see.
So there's been this disconnect. But the bigger point is, this is the start of what will be a long process of repairing relations and working through anger on both sides.
Having said that, though, I want to ask for your expertise, Mr. Donovan, about the Canadian politics. We know a lot of things are domestic politics. So the election just came to an end. There is enormous anger toward the conservative among the Canadian Chinese or Chinese Canadian. What would that mean for an administration headed by a prime minister that is a minority to look at the political atmosphere and think about the long-term prospect of Canada, China at this moment?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is in our system, we have had many minority governments over the years. In our election last week, Prime Minister Trudeau was reelected with a minority government, a lower percentage of the popular vote. It's a very legitimate thing in our country when this happens and there's a minority government. It's a first past the post system, and he beat Mr. O'Toole. But I also think that the government, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Garneau, certainly Mr. Dominic Barton, who is our ambassador in China, and many other officials, they want to put this behind them. I have a sense, and I just want to, reinforce something Carlos said. People-to-people relations during this, trade relations, business relations between Canada and China have grown. I think this is a very political issue, and I think that the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau worked with the Biden administration to make sure that they put this behind them. But again, as I said earlier, I think the lesson for Canada is to listen more. The Chinese were very angry about the Meng arrest. They were very angry. We kept saying, well, we have rule of law. Well, the Canadian population, the Canadian government has to understand that China has its own rule of law. It's not the Western rule of law. China doesn't want to be the West. China has their own rule of law. And this is where there's a disconnect. And this is, I think, in the Canadian media, a misunderstanding of the Chinese system. But credit has to go to the Biden administration and to the Chinese government for working out this arrangement that I believe is a win-win. And I think it signals, even with the new Trudeau minority government, that they want to move past this and get back on the right path.
At this point, how will Canada choose? Or will Canada force itself to choose?
There's a real split. On the one hand, you have the ideological elements that are opposed to communists for reasons that go beyond the current difficulties in the relationship. On the other hand, their constituents, folks in Western Canada, on the prairies, depend on China for trade. And there's a realization on the ground amongst some in the Conservative caucus that their constituents are choosing to increase trade with China, that the ties are increasing. So you have the political rhetoric that was beefed up during the election that comes from some within the Conservative movement. But then on the other hand, there is a more realistic element that says our constituents, our businesses, people in our electoral districts are choosing to engage with China, and we have to manage that reality. So I wouldn't paint the Conservatives as completely on one side. At the end of the day, that economic reality will catch up with them.
Yeah.
And they've been able to avoid it during the election. But that avoidance cannot go on forever. Economic reality will eventually force them, I think, to a position with China that's tied to the facts on the ground, that's tied to the trade reality, that's tied to what their constituents are doing.
During the very first meeting between the high-level officials of the Biden administration and the Chinese said it very clearly that there needs to be an overall relationship. It's not relationship A, B, C, they're not connected. So this is a very interesting point, that use what approach, what vision, what it means these days about bilateral relations that we are thinking about when developing relationship with China. Mr. Donovan, I want to also invite your expertise in that.
When the Biden administration met with Chinese officials in Alaska shortly after Mr. Biden was elected, as you recall, the American approach, in my opinion, was just awful. It was very patronizing, and I was stunned just listening to it. But what I noticed was the Chinese pushed back, and the Americans were giving a list of all of their grievances, and they didn't like the way China was doing this and China was doing that, and it's just very patronizing. It's not collegial. It's not nation to nation. It's like talking down to someone. And at the time, the Chinese foreign minister, and everyone noticed this, pushed back very hard and basically said, as we paraphrase, don't talk to us like that. We're not here to listen to what you're going to tell us to do. And I think it signaled, and I think time will tell, that signals significant change in global relations and the real emergence of China on the global stage. And basically, my taking away from that was that the Chinese are asking to be treated respectfully, as any nation should. I think we have to look at what we have in common. A lot of people here also feel the same way. We have to engage China on a nation-to-nation basis with respect. And if we have issues with China, we have to lay those issues on the table and have a discussion about them.
But I want to ask that from a business perspective, Mr. Dade. I mean, businesses needs to deal with realities, not just aspirations. So one could assume that the pressure coming from Washington toward Ottawa will be ever bigger. So how will Canada, be able to measure and balance and using what is now an opportunity rather than misuse it going to the wrong direction?
Sure. This one is actually a bit easier because there's been quite a bit written by Canadian history on this point. Look, ever since the founding of the two countries, we've had to balance our relations with the United States with our engagement elsewhere. If you go back to the 1950s, the Americans declared a grain embargo against China during China's greatest famine, the famine during the Great Leap Forward. Canada refused to go along with the U.S. embargo. We suffered. The Americans came after us for that. But we were competing with the Americans globally for grain sales and food sales, and the Americans were competing unfairly against us. So there was tension with our cooperation with the Americans during the Cold War, with forming NATO, with standing up the North American air defense, at the same time where our interests were being attacked by the Americans on grain sales globally, we stood up to the Americans. So we have done this historically. We have stood up to the Americans and paid a price for it. With Cuba, every few years, the Americans come after us for breaking their economic sanctions against Cuba. We have had to make laws in Canada outlawing the compliance with the American embargo against Cuba by Canadian companies. So we have a law that says if you're a Canadian company and the Americans come after you on the Cuban embargo, it is against the law in Canada to agree with the Americans. So this is a long-running theme. And most recently, the Americans during the NAFTA negotiation told us not to think about talking to China with trade. Meanwhile, the Americans went behind our back and signed their own agreement with China that really did great damage to Canadian farmers. So countries around the world know the U.S. is a political ally, but the U.S. is also an economic competitor. And if there is money on the table, the Americans will run you over in a New York second.
The American Marines moved out of Afghanistan to go to Iraq. We sent a battalion into Afghanistan because of the 9/11 attacks did affect Canada. We lost Canadians in those buildings. But the fact is that less than 6 months later, to penalize us because they were upset about us not participating in Iraq, they banned our beef. They found one mad cow up in Alberta, and the next thing you know, we had a massive beef crisis in this country. So economics, trade, these are all real politic. We're going to have disputes with the Americans. We've had them in the past, as Carlos said.
What is this? How would you characterize this moment for China and Canada if we could still hope for the better? Mr. Donovan, 1 or 2 sentences.
I think it's a rebirth of the relationship. I've heard constantly from my Chinese colleagues that I speak to here in Ottawa and others that they just are looking for a relationship that's based on mutual trust and respect. And if we could get back to that, they're open for business, and Canada's open for business. I think I have to congratulate the Biden administration, President Xi, and Prime Minister Trudeau and the government for making this deal happen, getting the two Michaels home, having Meng Wanzhou home. You know, she said from the beginning, not guilty, and she's home, not guilty. So let's move forward.
All right. Mr. Dade.
You know, it's going to be a long process. I would caution that there will have to be a lot to rebuild trust on both sides. China tends to want a comprehensive solution, talk about the entire relationship. In Canada, we are more transactional. I think in this case, the transactional approach is going to have to be the starting point. You have to rebuild trust. You do that step by step by step. So I would caution to maybe be a bit more open to working on things step by step. Okay. Trade is growing. People are increasing trade. Start there. That's a reality that cannot be denied. But don't throw out the step that you have because it's not everything. Take what's on the table and work with us on that and help us to build from there.
It's wonderful to hear two Canadian voices coming from different walks of life and who have been making the difference in the relationship. Dan Donovan and Carlo Dade. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Fascinating conversation. That's all the time we have for today. A very packed show. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.